when we're looking at this, what were your first notables in terms of what you would consider snub or surprise left off, like player who was left off the roster?
Yeah, I think that's a really good question because when you look across this roster, there's definitely a few that jump out, and not barring any of the injuries, right? Of course, that those players are all excluded. The first one in the forward crew that is not on this list is Ashley Hatch. She's a forward with Washington Spirit. She has been scoring goals. She's been in the World Cup mix or in the U.S. international roster mix for a while at this point. And she got cut off this list. Now the question we always have to ask ourselves here at Attacking Third and fans at home when you get upset about stuff like this, who would she replace? And that's something to me that is really hard to answer because between Alex Morgan and Megan Rapinoe, they're both entering their 4th World Cup in that forward crew. You've also got Trinity Rodman, Sophia Smith, Alyssa Thompson. Those are young stars that are have been arguably dubbed as the future of this team, and now they are the present of this team on this roster. And then you have Lynn Williams, who has fought her way back into this group and fought to prove herself that she deserves to be on the front 23, and she's fighting for a starting spot in that front line. And although Hatch isn't on this roster, I just don't see where the space would have fit in for her. She is definitely a role player. She can come in and be that goal scorer in times of need and tap it in. She's almost got that like Harry Kane-esque about her where she's at the right place at the right time. She's good with her head, but who would you take off this front line? So that's Ashley Hatch is one of the first ones that jumped out to me. And then as I talked about with the defender crew in this one, there's 7 defenders. And when we learned Becky Sauerbrunn wasn't going to be going, okay, that opens up a center back role. Perhaps we're going to see Tierna Davidson, who has been on the bubble of my U.S. roster. She was missed last year due to an ACL injury, but she's been back playing consistent 90-minute games with Chicago Red Stars. She has been called into U.S. camps as a training player, has experience formerly with the U.S. international roster. However, she's not called into this one. There are only 7 defenders on this roster, only 2 center backs. So to me, those are the 2 biggest snubs, but also I don't know who they would have replaced on this roster, right? Like that's the question we have to ask. Like, is there anyone that you think got snubbed that could have replaced someone else that's been named?
I don't know. If anything, it's brought up more curiosity for me. I won't even say questions. It's piqued my curiosity in what we're going to see from this team, particularly in that attacking area. I think if we were doing a predictions episode, even 4 months ago, I think we would have had Hatch is a bit of a lock on the roster, especially in light of some of the club play that we've seen with her on the Spirit as well. You look at and bring up potential match day scenarios. If Alex Morgan is ultimately that central number 9, who's a player that you can bring in positionally, and I think folks would automatically assume or say Hatch. I think you also we look a little further back as well and say, at one point, was that script a little bit flipped? Was Morgan going to be the backup option to a Macario, who would have been within this role a little bit more? So there's all of these changes that have occurred over the span of the last, if we want to go 18 months or last year or so. But I like I said, I think it's piqued my curiosity more than has sparked additional kind of hard-hitting questions. Because when we look at the forwards that are on here, Williams, Morgan, Rapinoe, Smith, Rodman, Thompson, I'm very excited about it. I think there's going to be those difficult or uneasy questions where it's like, okay, you've got some first-time World Cup participants here who are going to take on a big responsibility in that leading attacking role. But how's it going to look? And I think that is the question I think that I'm leaning into a bit more. Is there going to be a rotating cast? Are we going to see some more fluidity because of the forwards that are involved in this forward line core?
A lot of people in our chat right now talking about Hatch not being involved in this roster, as you and I are as well, and saying that they'd take her over a player like Rapinoe. And I mean, you can go back. Sandra and I have done our roster prediction for this for a number of times. I had Megan Rapinoe always going to the World Cup. And in the absence of Becky Sauerbrunn as a veteran who has a lot of experience internationally as the captain, now you lose all of that. I think that makes even more of an argument to bring Megan Rapinoe because she's been in these situations. This will be her 4th World Cup. She's got the veteran leadership. She's got the ability in the locker room. It's going to be a different role for her than we've seen in previous world stages. I mean, even you look back to the Olympics and Rapinoe had to change her role about the game that she was going to play and the role that she was going to play on this team. Now, if there's penalty kicks and we're coming down to it, you bet your bottom dollar that Black Laninowski is going to sub in Rapinoe because she's one that is going to finish penalty kicks, as is Alex Morgan. So you have to, when looking at this roster and breaking it down, you have to almost take a step back and look at the role players and look at the difference on these teams. Another player I want to mention a little bit and actually get your thoughts on a little bit too, Sandra, is Taylor Korniak, midfielder for San Diego Wave that about a year ago got called into the national team, a bit surprisingly, because Vlad Laninowski had seen her ability in the NWSL under Casey Stoney, also her partnership with Alex Morgan at the club level, called her in consistently to the national team. She got a number of caps. She got a number of starts, goals. We saw a role for Taylor Korniak in the midfield, and now she's not on this roster. A bit of a surprise. However, she did trail off in her performance level, and she's been dealing with injury this year.
Yeah, I think that's kind of what it boils down to. I think some of these, I don't know if I would actually say snub. I think it's a I think it's an omission based on combination of the things that you mentioned. Form and injury, unfortunately, and it's really, I think that part of it is especially tough to kind of lean into and think about because it affects so many players. I think you look at kind of those big type of injuries, and we knew the timelines and the difficult timelines for players to return from, whether it was ACLs to Macario or Press or Davison, I think at this point, and we'll probably talk about this as well. But those are the things that I'm looking at. So with Korniak specifically, to have had a lot of time with this team, because let's not act like she hasn't been involved in camps for at least the better part of a year. This is a player that was also tasked with some different things in the beginning of 2023. Like the coaching staff was like, let's continue to try some different things with Taylor Korniak here. And we got to see her in the defensive mid role a little bit more. Those are things that could perhaps sort of signal that you want to try to continue to work with and invest in a player in a build up to a World Cup. And then we get club play. We get the intel right from Andonovski saying, hey, there's going to be sets and groups of players that we task with certain things as they go back to play for their clubs. There's going to be a group of players that we tell them just to go ahead and keep it up and maintain their form. And there's going to be players that we task with certain things that we want them to work on. And unfortunately, I feel like Korniak was a player that maybe fell into that latter group. And then we see that she had to unfortunately start off the season and on the sideline with an injury. So she has worked her way back into playing into matches with San Diego Wave FC, but I just don't think the timing and minutes were there for them to say that they were going to go ahead and bring her in as a lock for a World Cup.
And lest we not forget, Julie Ertz returned.
Yeah, that's a huge factor as well. That's a
massive factor. We can't forget that happened. She not only returned to play, but returned in incredible form with a different mindset after being out on maternity leave, and has stepped in with Angel City and played her first back-to-back 90-minute games. So she's up to fitness level, and that takes a midfield spot and a veteran spot, maybe from someone like a Korniak.
Yeah, no, I'm curious about, I think maybe we can make a similar argument for someone in Midge Purse.
Yeah.
Another player that has specifically gotten call-ins under Andonovski's tenure as the head coach with this national team, but over these last 2 seasons has unfortunately had to deal with navigating these kind of little lingering and nagging type of injuries. And similar to what we saw in last season, where we saw her role with Gotham kind of elevate a little bit, and we see the type of team that they are when she's on the pitch. And unfortunately, she's had to have a more limited role again due to injuries. So watching this player, not be able to go out there and essentially continue to make a case
Yeah.
to crack a roster is tough. And I think there's a number of players I think who are missing from this final 23 player roster that we can look at and say it's a combination of these factors.
Right. And 23 is the smallest roster we have seen Blacko put together in a very long time. It's been 26, it's been 28. We've seen much higher numbers. And when you have to whittle it down, unfortunately, that means some names can't make it. And it, a lot of times when it comes down to those really, really small margins, it can be things off the pitch. It can be their experience. It can be their health. There are so many different factors that come into it. Just unfortunately, that it's not just like how you play on the pitch, because we are dealing with the elite of the elite, the 0.1% of the athletes in the world that Black-Witanowski gets to choose from.
I'm curious, in terms of how you brought up Julie Ertz and coming off of this virtual media availability with Andonovski and talking about her role specifically. I think that, again, my curiosity is piqued. There's a lot of players on this roster that I think were selected with intent to shift throughout the duration of the tournament in various positions on the pitch. I'm very curious to see
it is a
how that's going to look out.
very long tournament.
Yes.
Fans have to remember that their group stage in Group E is with 2 debutantes, Vietnam and Portugal, and then they're going up against Netherlands, the 2019 runners-up, the semifinals. They made it to the semifinals. They have a lot of tough competition to get through. It's also an expanded format this year with the World Cup, 32 teams. It's a long tournament. You have to be able to account for all the different factors. And in most recent world international history, we have to think about the Tokyo Olympics, and injuries happened that not only to goalkeepers, but superstar players in the midfield. You look at Julie Ertz playing with injury, and how you can kind of shift around the players on the field to get the most out of every single player in every single game. That way you are the ones lifting the cup at the end of it all.
Yeah, and hearing Andonovski allude to Ertz possibly being one of those players. This is someone who has played at the World Cup level, who has not been a stranger to playing in multiple positions. I mean, in that 2015 World Cup, was one of those debutante players and was tasked with playing the center back role. And then we saw in 2019 she was the answer to many of their problems in that defensive mid role during that tournament. So the fact that there's been some conversation about her ability to shift higher, lower on this pitch, I think was a little bit of a telling sign, and perhaps a little bit of an indicator and reveal into how they made the selections for this roster. Because I know with the announcement of Becky Sauerbrunn not being there, it set a lot of things in motion. And I think people were curious about who was going to get selected to the defender core of this team. And we do not see Tierna Davidson, nor do we see Casey Kruger. Big shock for you, or understandable, or massive snub? How are you feeling about these two not being on the roster?
Yeah, I think, as I mentioned, with Becky Sauerbrunn initially being out due to injury, my gut reaction was, okay, Tierna Davidson's going to be in there. However, Tierna Davidson wasn't on my prelim roster to make it. She was one of my bubble players just because she hasn't gotten back up to form. There's a little bit of inconsistencies, and coming back from an injury is difficult, let alone an ACL injury is tremendously difficult. And for her to try to continue to work back in that, I just think there was a lot of inconsistencies from Davidson's play. And frankly, Vlatko chose not to take another defender. Instead, he chose to keep his 7 defenders that he had, with his 6 forwards and his 7 midfielders. And I like that decision. As you mentioned, you have to look between the lines. When you have someone like a Julie Ertz who has slotted into that back line as a center back, that's what you're looking at. The versatility of an Ertz to be able to play in the 6, in the center back role, whatever that may be. And you have to look at the center backs that were named to this roster. Naomi Girma, who is going to be a starter for this team and for the next, hopefully 10, 15 years as her body allows her. She is the future of this center back team. She deserves this chance, and she was always going to be in that center back. And then you look at Alana Cook, another young player who has experience there. And they're 2 players that can stay healthy, can stay fit, and can run with that center back duo. So when you look at that, it makes a little bit of sense. There's also Emily Sonnet on this roster who could slot into that position. Now, the center backs are probably the two that we're going to see rotated the least throughout this World Cup tournament. I wouldn't be surprised if we see Girma and Cook make runs, maybe not throughout the group stages, but through the knockout rounds, they don't get rotated out of that position unless it's a dire situation. And then that's where we see Earths get rotated in. But I think in my mind, it's a smart decision not to bring Davidson and to bring Earths instead.
Well, they brought Sonnet. Is that the player that you rotate into this? I'm going to give you another one. You're the coach.
No.
It's Sonnet, it's Davidson, it's Kruger. Who are you taking to the World Cup in 2023?
Well, I mean, he's already taking Sonnet.
Yeah.
I see his understanding for taking Sonnet because she can play in the outside back and she can play the center back. And heck, we've seen her play the defensive midfield role for Laura Harvey and OL Reign over the last several months for club play. And maybe that was a conversation, right? We don't know what happened between player and coach. And there has been plenty of conversations between them, and Vlatko Andonovski is pretty transparent with his players about what he wants to see from them and working with their club coaches to make sure that's executed. If not in games, then there are situations in training where the players are put into those positions. And maybe that was a request from Vlatko Andonovski. Hey, can we see Emily Sonnet in the defensive six role just to give her a little bit more of that versatility? I get why he chose Sonnet. I do, because she can play at least two roles, outside back, center back, and potentially a third in the midfield.
Yeah, I mean, that's all where we've seen her, right? And for OL Reign and in club play in these first 2.5-ish months of league play in the NWSL, she's been a defensive midfielder for OL Reign. That is where she has played. I think for Chicago, we've typically seen Davidson in that center back role, specifically within these last handful of games in her return from an ACL. But Casey Kruger is one of those other versatile backs. I think for me, that was probably one of the more surprising omissions from this roster, because I think you look back to 2019 and how close she was to making that roster back then. And then now you sort of see her return from maternity leave and just kind of have a short window to build up from, right? We're talking just league play and one international window with the team in the build up to this World Cup. But someone who at this point in her career has literally played every position along a back line, whether it's within a 3-back or a 4-back. So I think I was curious about the omission for Kruger as well. I think if you're looking for someone to try to fulfill a purely defensive back type of role, whether it is as your left or right back or within either of those left or right center back positions. But again, more curiosities piqued for me on these 23 players versus actual questions, because I'm in agreement with you as well as what you touched on with Emily Sonnet. It wasn't just about a outside back role or a center back role. Perhaps this is a player that you slot up in a defensive mid role if needed. So maybe that's the final indicator. That was a final indicator for the coaching staff to say, this is the player that we're going to roll with and take.